When you hear the word Avatar, you generally think of $2 billion, because somehow that's what this franchise has done, not once, but twice. Unless you're talking about the other Avatar that can confuse things, but not for this discussion since this one is mostly about the blue people. And with 3 films already, it has become a powerhouse franchise, but not in the way most people associate the word franchise with many properties. It's the one many people forget literally most of the characters and their names, despite the massive box office success. It relies more on its world than someone to really connect with it. The point is, this isn't a franchise that needs your typical multitude of brand-based recognition, it needs to connect on universal themes, family, life, the environment that surrounds us. It's a world that pushes the bounds of technology in a livable space and never forgets where its path is on. And that holds up true to this day. With only 3 films, it has become the 12th highest grossing franchise in the world and it showed no signs of stopping anytime soon, climbing higher with each individual film. However, this also brings us to the topic of Avatar: Fire and Ash, the 3rd film that has only made $1.49 billion, which to be fair, is still one of the highest grossing films ever made and matches hits like Top Gun: Maverick, but it's still much lower than the $2.9 and $2.2 billion of the first film and Way of Water, which is a big drop to be honest. Again, any film would actually love to have that cross or that problem of being that low for that matter, where your lowest earners still make you billions. But it does bring up an interesting point about the film and what it represents going forward and what can be done, or what can get attention in future Avatar. Still, many people have gone out to see these films. Millions of people around the world take their time to see the value of the spectacle. But there is an edge to the value of seeing it, or something you've already done before. And there is a difference in value, of course, from a 2009 hit to a 2025 film, vastly different in regards in price and inflation, but somehow it still gets people out there regardless. Which brings us to the present topic. Why Avatar: Fire and Ash is just an okay film and nothing special like Avatar delivered previously, a film that critics and audiences praise for its visuals and spectacle, but criticize for its plot beats and repetitive nature that we've already seen, for a film that looks more like a filler and never lives up to the name of Fire and Ash. Now let's talk about the previous film, Avatar: The Way of Water. Picking up more than a decade after the first movie, we follow Jake Sully and Neytiri after they built a family together. They now have 4 biological kids, Neteyam, Loa, Kiri, and Little Tuk, plus adopting a little human boy named Spider. Life seems peaceful on Pandora until the RDA return in force, this time with a much bigger mission, to fully colonize the planet and strip it of its resources. And faced with the impossible choice to protect their family, Jake and Neytiri decide to leave the forest and seek refuge with the Metkayina, a reef-dwelling Na'vi clan who lives in harmony with the ocean. The Sully kids must adapt to an entirely new environment, culture, and new rules. Meanwhile, Quaritch is back, but this time back as a recombatant avatar with his old memories, hunting his old enemy with ruthless determination. And story-wise, what impressed people was the emotional core. The film shifted from the broad save the world narrative of the first movie to something more intimate, family, parenthood, and the lengths parents would go to keep their children safe. The Sully family dynamics feel real. It also feels deeper into the themes of belonging, identity, and the cost of war. Visually though, this is where Way of Water blew people's minds. James Cameron raised the bar to an insane level with the underwater sequences being revolutionary. Fully motion captured performances underwater, breathtaking coral reefs, bioluminescent creatures, massive Tolkien whales, and battles that mix air, land, and sea simultaneously. And that's what left a lot of people thinking that visually alone, it was worth the price, and it's still considered one of the best looking films ever made. Way of Water managed to feel both epic in scope and personal at the same time, which helped it cross $2.2 billion and proved audiences would still show up in a huge numbers. But now, let's go to the present and talk about Avatar: Fire and Ash. In the first part, the film picks off shortly after the events of Way of Water, with the Sully family living amongst the Metkayina reef. The story opens up in a heavy place. The family is in deep grief over the loss of Neteyam, where we see the emotional toll on everyone. Neytiri is consumed by pain and growing hatred towards humans, Jake has become distant and hyper-protective, and Loak especially struggles with survivor's guilt, blaming himself for what happened. The early scenes focus on the fractured family dynamic, where there's a quite spiritual moment with Loak at an ancestral tree, and other important decisions including sending Spider back to the human camp for safety with his breathing mask fails, which does lead to an important moment of Spider actually being able to breathe on Pandora being connected with Ewa finally, which is a very interesting dynamic there. But other than that, they all get soon ambushed by the aggressive Ash people led by the fierce Varang. This attack scatters the family and kicks off the larger conflict. And on paper with this first part, this setup had real potential, dealing with grief, family tension, and introducing a new Na'vi clan with a different philosophy that felt like a natural evolution, the ones that blame Ewa rather than support it. And the visuals in the scene are very breathtaking to support that feature. But this is also where the film starts to feel a little weak for many people. While the grief is handled with some strong emotional beats early on, it didn't dig as deep as it promises. The family conflicts and character arcs fall back into familiar patterns we've seen before, and going back and forth between Quaritch and this new clan and the RDA and back to the family. The promising setup begins to feel like it's just remixing Way of Water rather than breaking new ground. So when you move to the next act of Avatar Fire and Ash, the story ramps up as Quaritch returns in full force. The recombatant Colonel is still hunting Jake and the Sully family, but his motivations are getting more complicated, and this is the part where he forms a dangerous alliance with Varang and the Ash people, using their aggression and knowledge of Pandora to press the attack. But at the same time, he continues his twisted pursuit of Spider that he now sees as his son. The father-son dynamic of Quaritch and Spider is still one of the more interesting parts of the middle section, and Spider in all this is caught in the middle of this conflicting dynamic, the one with the Sullys trying to know what to do with him, and Quaritch wanting to show rare moments of something like paternal care, but it's always mixed with manipulation. And while this mixed dynamic had potential, it also contributes to why the film seems repetitive. Instead of fully committing to something new, it often circles back to familiar chase and confrontation beats that the other two films showed. And on the RDA side, they feel even less interesting this time around. General Ardmore returns as the main military leader, pushing the colonization efforts with the use of corporate greed and resource extraction tools, where they bring more bigger ships, firepower, and a willingness to ally with the aggressive Ash people when it suits them. But unlike Quaritch's personal arc, the broader RDA story stays pretty one note and sidelined. The humans here are still the same profit-driven invaders we've seen from before, but there aren't many fresh ideas or deeper explorations on their motivations. It mostly serves as background threat and setup for big action set pieces rather than adding anything meaningful or new to the story. The story is mostly focused on these Avatar-like people or the Na'vi itself, rather than the human actions in a more deeper way as we understand ourselves. And that's very disappointing because there's a lot that you can do with it, but it seems like they don't want to. This is the part of why this middle to late act starts to drag for some viewers. The human villain side lacks the spark or novelty that the new Na'vi clans and family drama try to bring. And in the later acts, the film does build towards its climax with the great action. Quaritch and Varang's alliance leads to a huge confrontation involving RDA forces, the Ash people, and the united Na'vi clans. Jake steps back into his Torque Makto role, rallying allies for a large-scale battle that mixes air, sea, and volcanic elements. There are intense personal fights, with Nateri going after Varang, Jake and Quaritch clashing again, while Kiri plays a spiritual role, eventually calling on Ewa and the wildlife to turn the tide. Visually, this final stretch is one of the strongest parts of the movie, again with this action and set pieces and the emotional beats, but story-wise it once again leans on the same heavily formula we've seen before. Big bad alliance that threatens the family and Pandora, the Na'vi unite, Ewa intervenes, good triumphs, where many people just feel that it does feel exciting here in the later acts, but it just didn't offer something fresh enough for an emotional payoff. The biggest problem with the ending of Avatar Fire and Ash is how unsatisfying and open-ended this feels. After the big climax, we get the confrontation between Jake, Quaritch, and Spider. In a rare moment, Jake and Quaritch are working together to save Spider when he's about to fall. There's even a hint of possible understanding in Quaritch, but instead of any real resolution when the family comes back to face him, Quaritch just throws himself off the edge into the fiery abyss below. We don't see him die in this scene, he just disappears into smoke and flames, leaving it completely ambiguous whether he survived, which we probably know in the future Avatar films he probably did. It's the classic the villain falls but he'll probably be back in the next movie type of move, considering that human Quaritch died and they did resurrect him. And similarly, in the case of Varang, she gets overpowered, especially after Kiri taps into Ewa's power and basically just disappears from the final battle, where there's no real confrontation payoff after, where she just flees to fight another day, disappearing from the final act of the film like she wasn't even existing. These choices make the ending feel like it's not really the ending of anything. It's clearly setting up future movies instead of giving this chapter a long sense of closure, unlike what the last film did, especially, which closed and tied things together, where the ending is just Spider is accepted in this tree with all the dead people we've seen since the first Avatar film, and of course people who died in this film that are now interconnected within Ewa's living branch. And tying it all together, Avatar Fire and Ash is a perfect example of why the third film just didn't quite work the way the first two did. While Way of Water felt innovative by completely shifting the world to the ocean reefs with new cultures and underwater spectacle that blew people away, Fire and Ash mostly stays in that very familiar territory. It does introduce the Ash people in volcanic environments, but it never fully challenges itself or explores those new areas in a fresh way that was to be expected with the name Fire and Ash. The biggest new idea, of course, is Spider being able to finally breathe Pandora's air, alongside a few other small developments, but that's not enough. The story beats, the family conflicts, the RDA threats, and the big Awa saves the day climax just felt like we've all seen that before. And that's why it probably only made around $1.49 billion. Still a huge, enormous success that any film would want, but compared to the previous two, it shows that audiences are mostly willing to show up for the groundbreaking spectacle and the feeling of discovering something new in Pandora. When the film relies more on the same familiar environments and story rhythms, however, it just doesn't click the same way. And as a franchise, Avatar still works incredibly well on a technical and visual level, but Fire and Ash proved that to keep people coming back in those massive numbers, it needs to keep innovating and exploring the world in new, bold directions. Where in the end, what a lot of us were hoping Avatar and Fire and Ash would to be was something more ambitious. We expected to be fully introduced to a rich volcanic side of Pandora, deep dives into the Ash people's culture, their harsh way of life shaped by fire and survival, and breathtaking new environments that felt as fresh as the ocean in Way of Water. Instead, however, we mostly got Way of Water Part 2. Don't get me wrong, that's still a great environment with incredible visuals, but it comes with all the same repetitive story issues we've seen from before. And here's hoping that the future films lean harder into those unexplored parts of Pandora and give us bold, new experiences that this franchise is capable of delivering. That's all there is to be said. I'm all done, and I see you.